In the scorching desert of ancient Mesopotamia, one of Rome's most powerful men met an end so grotesque that it would haunt the empire for generations. Marcus Licinius Crassus, the richest man in Rome, built his fortune on the suffering of others, only to discover that greed, when taken too far, becomes its own executioner. This is the story of how gold, the very thing that made him powerful, became the instrument of his most horrific demise. The year was 53 BCE, and Rome's insatiable hunger for conquest had reached a fever pitch. Three men, known as the Triumvirate, ruled the known world through an uneasy alliance: Pompey the Great, Julius Caesar, and Marcus Crassus. While his partners carved their legacies through military genius, Crassus faced a humiliating truth: he was seen as nothing more than a banker among warriors. His vast wealth, accumulated through real estate speculation and slave labor, bought him political influence but not the respect he desperately craved. For years, Crassus watched as Caesar conquered Gaul and Pompey dominated the Mediterranean, their victories echoing through Rome's marble halls, while his own achievements were merely measured in vaults of gold. The sting of being called the third wheel of the triumvirate gnawed at him constantly. At 60 years old, most men might have been content to enjoy their riches. But Crassus saw only one path to true glory: military conquest that would rival the triumphs of his more famous allies. The Parthian Empire beckoned to him like a golden prize beyond Rome's eastern frontier. Stretching from the Euphrates to the Indus, this vast kingdom controlled the lucrative silk and spice routes that connected east and west. Crassus became obsessed with the idea of conquering Parthia, convinced it would not only bring him military glory but also unimaginable wealth, enough gold and silver to make even his fortune seem modest. Yet the Senate, suspicious of his ambitions, refused to grant him the traditional declaration of war. Undeterred, Crassus pressed forward. In 55 BCE, he arrived in Syria as governor, immediately preparing for his grand invasion. He ignored the warnings of local commanders who understood Parthian military tactics, dismissing their concerns as cowardice. After all, the desert kingdoms had always fallen to Roman discipline and engineering. Why should Parthia be different? His confidence was bolstered by intelligence reports suggesting internal strife within the Parthian court, making them appear vulnerable to a decisive Roman strike. Crassus assembled a massive force, 7 legions totaling nearly 40,000 men, supported by 4,000 cavalry and an equal number of light infantry. This army represented one of the largest expeditionary forces Rome had ever mustered for eastern conquest. Among his officers was his beloved son, Publius, a proven warrior who had served with distinction under Caesar in Gaul. The presence of his heir intensified Crassus's ambition. This campaign would establish a dynasty of military glory. The invasion began in the spring of 53 BCE, with Roman forces crossing the Euphrates at Jugma. Initial progress appeared to validate Crassus' confidence. Local settlements surrendered without resistance or fell quickly to Roman siegecraft. The flat Mesopotamian terrain seemed ideal for Roman heavy infantry tactics, and early intelligence suggested that King Artavasdes II of Parthia was distracted by internal rebellions, leaving the frontier lightly defended. However, what Crassus mistook for vulnerability was actually a carefully orchestrated Parthian strategy. General Serena, the talented commander of Parthian forces, was deliberately drawing the Romans deeper into the desert, away from their supply lines, and into terrain that favored Parthian cavalry over Roman infantry. The few skirmishes that occurred were tactical retreats designed to give Crassus false confidence while exhausting his army through forced march in brutal heat. As the Roman army pushed deeper into the Mesopotamian desert, the true nature of their enemy began to reveal itself. The Parthians were not the disorganized barbarians that Roman propaganda portrayed, but a sophisticated military power with centuries of experience fighting in their homeland's harsh conditions. Their army was built around mobility and ranged combat, employing heavy cavalry known as cataphracts for shock attacks and lighter horse archers who could strike from impossible distances while remaining beyond Roman reach. Serena's strategy exploited every weakness in Roman military doctrine. Where Romans relied on close formation fighting and engineering, the Parthians emphasized speed and flexibility. While Romans expected set-piece battles with clear objectives, The Parthians preferred harassment and attrition, slowly wearing down their opponents' resources and morale. Most critically, where Romans assumed their enemies would eventually engage in decisive combat, the Parthians were content to avoid direct confrontation while bleeding their opponents dry through constant skirmishing. The psychological warfare was equally sophisticated. Parthian scouts would appear on distant ridges, just visible enough to keep Roman soldiers on edge, then vanish before any pursuit could be organized. Supply convoys came under attack from invisible enemies who struck without warning and disappeared into the vastness of the desert. Sleep became a luxury as soldiers reported strange sounds and movements throughout the night, leaving the entire army exhausted and paranoid. Crassus began to realize that traditional Roman tactics were proving inadequate against this new type of warfare. His heavy infantry, invincible in European forests or Mediterranean coastal plains, struggled in the heat terrain and against unconventional enemy tactics. The cavalry forces he had assembled were insufficient for the mobile warfare that dominated the region, and his supply lines became increasingly vulnerable to Parthian raids that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. The critical moment came at Carrhae, a small city in northern Mesopotamia where Crassus decided to make his stand. Local geography seemed to favor his position. Hills provided defensive positions for his infantry, while the presence of a water source would solve his supply problems. Intelligence reports suggested that Surena's main force was approaching, offering the decisive battle Crassus believed would vindicate his entire campaign and demonstrate Roman superiority once and for all. The Battle of Carrhae began at dawn on June 9, 53 BCE, with Roman forces arranged in their traditional formation, heavy infantry in the center, cavalry on the wings, and light troops screening the main force. Crassus positioned himself at the center while his son, Publius, commanded the right-wing cavalry. The formation looked impressive in the morning light, standards gleaming, armor polished, representing the finest military machine the ancient world had ever seen. However, Surena's approach revealed the true brilliance of Parthian military science. Instead of a traditional army formation, the Romans faced a purely cavalry force that moved like a single organism across the desert floor. The Parthian heavy cavalry, armored from head to toe in gleaming metal scales, formed the center, while thousands of horse archers flowed around them like water, creating a constantly shifting tactical landscape that Roman commanders could scarcely predict or counter. The battle opened with a massive Parthian arrow barrage that darkened the sky above the Roman formation. Unlike previous enemies who exhausted their ammunition quickly, the Parthians had organized supply trains of fresh arrows that kept their archers continuously supplied. Roman shields, designed to stop spears and swords, proved inadequate against the sustained missile bombardment that continued hour after hour without respite, gradually wearing down Roman morale and effectiveness. In a moment of youthful bravado, Publius Crassus made the fatal decision to break formation and charge the Parthian center with his cavalry wing. This played directly into Surena's strategy. The heavy cataphracts absorbed the Roman charge while horse archers surrounded the exposed cavalry force. Cut off from the main army and encircled by enemies attacking from all sides, Publius' forces were systematically destroyed in full view of Crassus and the remainder of the Roman army. The death of Publius marked the psychological turning point of the battle. Surena's men severed the young man's head and mounted it on a spear, parading it before the Roman battle line while his father watched in stunned horror. The sight of his son's head bobbing above enemy ranks shattered whatever composure Crassus had maintained throughout the campaign. The confident general who had crossed the Euphrates months earlier was now a broken man, barely able to give coherent orders. Roman discipline began to collapse as the grim reality of their situation became clear. They were trapped in hostile territory, surrounded by an enemy who could strike at will while remaining beyond retaliation. Water supplies were running low, the dead and wounded accumulated faster than they could be treated, and every attempt to break out resulted in heavier casualties. The desert, which had once seemed like an open highway to conquest, transformed into a prison with no visible escape. As night fell, Crassus attempted to organize a retreat toward the nearby city of Carrhae, hoping that urban terrain would neutralize Parthian cavalry advantages. However, the withdrawal devolved into a rout as exhausted Roman soldiers abandoned their equipment and discipline in a desperate bid for safety. Thousands were cut down during the chaotic night march, while others simply collapsed from exhaustion and heat stroke, left behind by comrades who could barely save themselves. The remnants of Rome's great eastern army stumbled into Carrhae as dawn broke. Having lost nearly half their strength in a single day of combat, the proud legions that had crossed the Euphrates were reduced to a desperate mob of survivors, standards lost, confidence shattered, and their leader broken by grief and the magnitude of his failure. Crassus had achieved the decisive battle he desired, but the decision had gone entirely against him. Surenna, rather than pressing his advantage with an immediate assault on the city, opted to demonstrate Parthian magnanimity by offering negotiations. He sent envoys under flags of truce, proposing a meeting between commanders to discuss terms for Roman withdrawal. The offer seemed reasonable. Both sides had suffered casualties, and the Parthians had proven their point about Roman vulnerability. For Crassus, desperate to salvage something from the disaster, the proposal offered hope of saving at least some of his men. The meeting was arranged to take place on neutral ground between the two armies, with both commanders accompanied by small retinues of officers. Crassus, despite warnings from subordinates who suspected treachery, agreed to the parley. His desperate need to believe a solution was possible overcame his tactical judgment. He clung to the hope that his great gamble hadn't resulted in complete catastrophe for Rome and personal ruin for himself. What happened next remains disputed among ancient historians, but the outcome was clear enough. The meeting erupted into violence as Parthian soldiers overwhelmed the Roman delegation. Whether this was premeditated treachery or the result of misunderstandings and mutual suspicions, Crassus soon found himself a prisoner of the man who had destroyed his army and killed his son. The richest man in Rome was now entirely at the mercy of enemies who had every reason to hate what he represented. Surenna's treatment of his captive revealed the depth of Parthian fury against Roman ambitions. This was not merely a defeated general to be ransomed or executed quickly. Crassus embodied everything the Parthians despised about Roman expansion. His invasion had been unprovoked, motivated purely by greed and ambition, launched without regard for Parthian sovereignty or the lives that would be lost in pursuit of his personal glory. The decision to execute Crassus in a manner befitting his character and crimes reflected both Parthian justice and their understanding of symbolic messaging. In a culture that valued honor and measured character by actions rather than wealth, Crassus epitomized everything contemptible about Roman values. His death needed to send a message not just to Rome, but to any future invaders who might mistake Parthian territories for easy conquests. The method chosen was both practical and deeply symbolic. Molten gold, the very metal that had defined Crassus' life and motivated his disastrous invasion, would become the instrument of his death. Parthian craftsmen heated gold until it reached a liquid state, creating a substance that could burn through human tissue while carrying profound symbolic meaning. The man who had worshipped gold above all else would experience its true nature, beautiful but deadly, precious yet ultimately destructive. The execution took place before an audience of Parthian nobles and captured Roman soldiers, transforming it into both a judicial proceeding and a public demonstration. Crassus was forced to his knees while Parthian soldiers held his mouth open, preventing any last words or pleas for mercy. The molten gold was poured slowly, ensuring maximum suffering while creating a spectacle that would be remembered for generations throughout the ancient world. The physical agony was unimaginable. Liquid gold, at temperatures exceeding 1900 degrees Fahrenheit, burned through his mouth, throat, and internal organs while Crassus remained conscious for the horrifying ordeal. Yet the symbolic message was equally critical. The man who had valued gold above human life, who had built his fortune through exploitation and violence, was experiencing gold's true destructive force. His worship of wealth had literally become his damnation. Witnesses described Crassus' final moments as a grotesque parody of his life's ambitions. The mouth that had once spoken of conquest and glory was filled with the very metal he had pursued across continents. The throat that had delivered speeches about Roman destiny was burned beyond recognition. The body that had reveled in luxury beyond imagination was transformed into a haunting warning about the consequences of unchecked greed and ambition. The aftermath of Crassus' death sent shockwaves throughout the ancient world, extending far beyond the immediate military disaster. News of the execution reached Rome within weeks, igniting panic among the ruling class, who suddenly realized that their eastern frontier was not secure. The Parthians demonstrated that they had both the capability and willingness to inflict humiliating defeats upon Roman arms. The myth of Roman invincibility, a narrative carefully cultivated through centuries of expansion and conquest, had been shattered in the Mesopotamian desert. Rome was compelled to reconsider its approach to warfare and politics, recognizing the destructive path of hubris that Crassus had embodied. His tale became a cautionary legend, illustrating how ambition unmoored from ethics or foresight could lead to abject failure. As years flowed into decades, the legacy of Crassus transformed from that of a wealthy magnate to a macabre tale told by mothers to warn their children against the perils of greed and ambition. His name became synonymous with hubris, a spectral reminder that those who thirst for power and wealth without regard for moral considerations may find themselves consumed by the forces they seek to control. In the annals of history, the story of Marcus Licinius Crassus remained not merely a tale of a man and his tragic end, but a profound reflection on the human condition. It became a story of the dark side of ambition, a narrative about how the pursuit of wealth and glory can blind one to the dire consequences of their actions. His gruesome execution served as an eternal reminder that unchecked greed could lead to a pitiful end, urging future generations to tread a more virtuous path, one where the quest for power does not eclipse the fundamental tenets of honor and humanity. Thus, the ghost of Crassus lingered in the echoes of history, in the whisper of the winds that swept across the Mesopotamian sands where he met his fate, and within the hearts and minds of those who would come after, forever etched in the collective memory of mankind. Subscribe to our channel and hit the bell to support our work. Never miss an upload. Like this vid, drop a comment and share it with others to help us grow this historical community.